Welcome to the Northern Ontario Mining Showcase podcast. It's a limited series for the Echo Community Podcast Network by Story Studio Network and Clark Communications. We highlight the influential voices, partners, and leaders who are driving innovation, research, and development, creating new market opportunities and new ways of doing business in the mining industry.
Daniella Dimitrov is with us, and it's funny how this place is, we're at the Metro Toronto Convention Center. We're in the North Building, and people are looking at this floor space and saying, holy cow, the Northern Ontario Mining Showcase has taken up a huge footprint. What you don't realize by walking up the escalator to here is it's less than half of the space taken up by PDAC. This is an enormous event.
It's an enormous event, and I understand we're at record attendance, 30,000 people from 130 plus countries. I call it the Super Bowl of the mining industry, so it's certainly exciting to be here. And I think the other thing that struck me when I saw the attendance numbers and I walked into the building this morning is you would not have guessed that our industry has actually had a tough time last year. And judging by the record attendance and by the energy that I really felt walking into the building.
So take me back to that. I mean, what made it a tough time last year? This can't just be COVID.
Yeah, well, not at all. It's not COVID. It is really the lack of capital that the industry has faced really in the last couple of years. We have seen over a period of time capital flee away from the industry.
And why is that?
I think a number of reasons. One, I would say that back in 2010, 2011, 2012, when we were looking at the commodity supercycle, perhaps the mining industry got overly excited and built too much. We had a number of overruns, so we took on a lot of leverage to build. So we didn't necessarily have a disciplined capital allocation that took into consideration growth, because we have to sustain ourselves. Because every day our assets get smaller. So this isn't a recurring revenue business where you make widgets and tomorrow you make widgets
Sell
every
more
day.
widgets to the widget buyers.
That's right.
Yeah.
Every day you take the rocks out of the ground and your asset is smaller every day. And so the strategy to growth, it's a necessity in our industry. And so I think a number of investors lost a lot of money at that time. And we have been hesitant to come back into the industry, even though the industry, I would say, is a lot more disciplined. Today, leverage has come down for both gold companies and base metal companies. We're much more disciplined capital allocators and also return capital to shareholders in addition to continuing to invest in the business. So that's one reason. A second could be that the time horizon between finding a deposit and that first dollar of revenue that you're going to generate from that deposit that you have found is probably about 16 to 18 years. And that is a really, really long time for that, the risk reward from a capital allocation perspective by those that allocate capital. And with all of, we have a saying that all of the low-hanging fruit is gone. And that has driven the timelines to be greater. So those are some of the reasons.
So does that change the just the general strategy and the direction of the sector? Because what you're describing is that there's a clear directional shift here, that you're not going to be able to do it like you always used to do it.
That's right.
Right?
That's right. We're not going to be able to do it like we always used to do it. You got to be more creative, certainly, to bring a deposit into production. We've seen some financing packages that took place in the last couple of years where you're really bringing together equipment financing, a streamer or a royalty provider, some debt and some equity, and you really got to get innovative to get a development package together. Of course, on those with large balance sheets don't have that issue. But if we don't invest...
But even at that case where you've got people with large balance sheets, doesn't that sort of lend itself, based on the way you've described it, to some complacency? There's a little bit of jeopardy there if you're not careful.
there is a little bit of jeopardy, and I think the danger we face is you got to invest in exploration.
Right.
In order to build that pipeline so that ultimately we can use that disciplined capital allocation to build a mine. And therefore, we've got to have that investment at the exploration stage. And those are the companies that have had a really, really hard time getting financed over the last 18 to 24 months.
And nothing really happens if they sort of dry up. I mean, that's the front end of the funnel, so to speak.
That is
right?
the front end of the funnel. They take on the risk to look for that discovery. And of course, the majors are continuing to invest in exploration. But some CEOs of majors say that if you give $1 to a junior, that junior can make that dollar go a lot farther. And a lot of that dollar goes into the ground, whereas perhaps the capital efficiencies of $1 in the hands of a major might be less so. You've got infrastructure, G&A, and all sorts of other things. So, to your point,
there's a few worms in that can that make it more complicated and less clear.
That's right. Right.
Tell me about so specifically. I know that I Am Gold works in Africa. It works in North America. Are there, when we talk about those various jurisdictions and then the challenges overarching for the industry, are there places in the world where it is easier to manage that first, and then the second part of that is easier is not always necessarily better for the outcome in terms of whether it's the investor, the environment, governance, social, all those things that we take into account. So there's a level of complexity there even when we start to talk about various jurisdictions around the world where the mining is happening.
I think geopolitics is one of the biggest risk factors of the industry today, and even jurisdictions that one may have thought are much more approachable, and we see what's happened in Panama with Cobre Panama and First Quantum. I think that is a risk that really has increased in terms of the industry, and I think with the inshoring, a lot of countries are looking at their own natural resources and saying either you need to build processing here, or the economic benefits that the country shares with a particular mining industry may not be enough back to this is the way that we always did it, right. And we're providing jobs and we're building schools and communities, and therefore it's okay that we're mining in a particular country. I think we're going to continue to see the complexity of how those relationships are defined between countries and mining companies that are accessing natural resources in those countries, to be something that we're going to have to work at more, and also at the early stage, not exactly once you have spent $10 billion and build a very large copper mine, but working to define those relationships earlier, and looking at the economic benefit being much greater to the host country.
Well, right over your shoulder there's a kiosk, and it's a rather large site there for Kazakhstan, and they're here. And I say that only because when we look at, you talk about the geopolitical issues, there's a different posture when we talk about the countries for the former Soviet Union or Russia itself and so on. And we know, not to get into a conversation necessarily about Ukraine and Russia, but the approach to ownership, the approach to how the investments are allocated, who gets what out of all of that, even there, I mean, it becomes a bit of a hazardous journey, let's say.
That's right.
Sometimes trying to figure out where the best directions are. And, even on their list, they talk about a lot of the things that Kazakhstan is actually mining. We're number 2 in this, we're number 1 in that. And the fact of the matter is, oftentimes, those are minerals that we need around the world, not just in Kazakhstan.
That's right.
So it's a real dance that has to be played to make sure that we're getting it out of there, that we're not actually, if we want to get into a whole question around human rights and all that becomes a very fast and slippery conversation.
It sure does, and investors are a lot more focused on that. So geopolitical risk, understanding what's happening in a particular country, either from a security perspective, you talked about West Africa, a number of countries there have had military coups. You talk about Kazakhstan, a huge uranium miner that provides almost half of the uranium that's being used by, Russia and China. So you're digging deep, and the investors are a lot more focused on how they allocate capital based on those jurisdictions. So we have an incredible opportunity, obviously, in Canada, because we've got the stability, whatever you might want to say about whatever government is
rule of law
there.
matters.
Rule of law,
right?
Exactly. We've got that. We've got the talent. The mining industry plays such a critical role in our country. We've got the schools. Although I think we've got to do a better job at making this industry more attractive to the new generation. We've got an unbelievable natural endowment from a geology perspective and so on. And so that really presents a tremendous opportunity for our country to really get back to, I think, being a premier destination for companies and for capital.
Yeah, Minister Rickford was here this morning, the Minister of Northern Affairs, and he was talking specifically about investments that the Ontario government is going to make in a number of mining companies in Northern Ontario. But I thought it was interesting that in the course of his conversation, he pointed out the sort of the balance between forestry and mining.
Yeah.
And in that case, let's face it, it's hard to say that gold is a renewable resource. We can't really.
Sure.
We'll wait a little while to get the next batch. But the need to be able to say we are blessed with the geology that allows us to have this kind of leadership role. We have this kind of boreal forest that gives us this opportunity to have a leadership role around the world. My own sense of this, and I'm just kind of scratching the surface, I'm not certain we're telling a good enough story about this.
Yeah, I think we got to do a better job at it, and I think we've seen a series of announcements over the last couple of months where, there's a renewed focus on permitting and that realization of, wow, it takes quite a long time to permit a mine in Canada, where you've got the provincial and the federal processes if both of them come into play, and
then Indigenous communities, First Nations,
that's right. And it seems like the permitting process has been a sequential process, which really adds to the timeline. So I see a renewed focus around how do we make permitting more efficient, not make it easier, but make it more efficient, and that transparency and knowing what the milestones are and knowing that you can get through a process within X period of time, provided you meet your own milestones, that's really, really critical. I look at, I'm on a board of a company in Brazil, and the company has 6 mines and 3 smelters. And say what you will about Brazil, but the permitting process is very efficient at the end of the day. And so I think that's something that we're going to see movement on, and that was a commitment that was made by Minister Wilkinson on that. And I think bringing together, and the one piece for us is infrastructure, right? And I don't know if Minister Rickford talked about that, but let's take Ring of Fire, for example, right?
Yep.
And so perhaps, if, not an investment directly into a mining company, but how do we work together with governments, communities to build that infrastructure? We see mining companies.
Just the roads.
That's right. I mean, I think Agnico has built 300 kilometers of roads and none of it, right? And so I think there are real opportunities to think about the partnerships and how we can bring it all together in a better way. I look at the IRA, and I saw Jigar speak at an earlier conference this week, and he was talking about the fact that they have 10,000 engineers and geologists and specialists and experts at their disposal to review applications and processes that come on their desk. They're also working to coordinate their permitting processes and working with other parts of government to at least provide that efficiencies. Again, not cutting corners.
No, but you got to have more than one ball in the air at a time.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And so when we say, what can bring capital back on the industry, I don't think it's just one thing. I think it's continuing the discipline, more efficient permitting, bringing talent into the industry, and really working together on solving infrastructure, again, permitting, capital, and so on. So
we got a few minutes here, and I want to touch on two things you just talked about. One is capacity, and that's that skill development. But the other one is this whole, and ESG has become a fairly prominent, addition to the lexicon in this room. And I think rightly or wrongly, it's being used, that there are accusations of greenwashing, and I think those accusations, and they're in many cases legitimate. Like, shut up, you're not really doing anything for the environment here, just because you're ticking a box. My own sense of it, though, is it's gone beyond the C-suite in terms of this is something we should probably do. There's more of a commitment because there are stakeholders and investors and just the average folk walking along Front Street here in Toronto thinking, if we're going to do the mining, it better be environmentally friendly. There has to be a social benefit, and the governance metrics have to match. So there's a real, more of a general, wider peripheral vision of what that means now. And I get a sense that it's actually having more of an undercurrent of effect on what happens with natural resources in general, whether it's mining or forestry or, whatever it might be. Give me your read.
I think mining in a socially responsible and sustainable manner has been something that has been with the industry for some time. Sure, we've had, the odd set of circumstances where you read an article and you think, that doesn't help the industry. But the idea of getting your social license to operate in a particular community or in a particular license has been with this industry for quite some time. I think what we're seeing is that the community and the companies are being more transparent and more precise about that.
Mm-hmm.
So we've gone from producing sustainability reports where we're showing pictures of how we building schools and other contributions within a community to being pretty specific around, we've reduced water usage by X.
Right.
We have our GHG emissions are Y. This is where we want to get to by 2025. Here's the composition of our workforce. This is where we want to get to. So I think that's one change that we have seen, where the information and the transparency is a lot crisper than it used to be. I think boards are more focused on it because you've got targets that are out there, and so you've got to now you're allocating capital towards meeting the targets that you put out there because you put yourself out there.
Yep.
And it's almost like monitoring, your production guidance, over the next 3 years, and thinking about, okay, we're not going to make that GHG emission reduction. Can we allocate more capital to it? What are we going to do? Are we going to buy carbon credits, et cetera?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, we've seen a backlash, obviously, in the U.S. around the use of that term. And there's some stats around that term's mentioned, less than half the time that it used to be if you go back to 22 or 23 quarterly calls of the S&P 500, let's say.
Okay.
But I think people are still doing it, but just calling it something different, sustainability, responsible mining, but are still focused on that and those metrics and those targets that they put out there.
Yeah, and I think it's become more conversational in many respects, right? So that's a necessary part of it. We do a lot of work with the forestry industry, and that's why I bring it up. But it's interesting to me how I'm beginning to hear folks in the mining sector talk about how they can lower their carbon emissions because they can rely on biofuel to actually, heat and provide energy for the mine and all. So all of a sudden there is this, thinking outside of what we're doing specifically in mining, where it's happening in the bush where you're actually located probably, right? So there are solutions right there where you live.
And I think it also is driving innovation. I saw Robert Friedland spoke at the conference I was on at last week. And he was talking about a new technology that he'd been working on with, capital from Breakthrough Energy, Bill Gates' venture fund, and others, to, instead of crushing and grinding rocks, actually pulsate the rocks. And that technology would take a fraction of the energy that is being used right now in the crushing and the grinding.
The way we always used to do it,
the way that we always used to do it.
Yeah.
So it is driving. I mean, there's low-hanging fruit in front of us. It is driving innovation. And I think the one thing that I'm quite excited about is microreactors. And one of the things, particularly since the low-hanging fruit is gone and we're in the middle of the jungle or we're up north, I worked for a company called Baffinland at one point in time, iron ore mine north of the Arctic Circle. We were barging diesel during the open water season and storing diesel on site over the winter in order to be able to complete exploration activities and so on. And if you look at some of these microreactors that you can fit on the back of a truck, is going to make some of these deposits much more accessible and at the same time benefit communities because you're going to be able to generate more energy than you need to use. That's right.
Right?
That's right.
So it just those are the dots that are easy to connect.
That's right.
But before you go, all sounds great in terms of the new direction. I talk about people who are excited about the new technology and the innovation and everything else. It's a new skill set though. And it's those who are coming into the industry, whether it's forestry or mining or anything that takes you out to the remote regions, are less likely to want to spend time in the middle of winter up in the Arctic Circle dealing with a mine. We have to actually look at ways in which innovation, technology, automation breaks through to deal with that in the remote area, and I can see how that will happen. But we need a different skill set and a brain rewired to be able to do that, maybe from downtown Toronto in an office or a laboratory or whatever it might be.
Sure.
But where are we with that? Because that's where we're going to have to go.
I think we are not in a good place with talent in the sense that we do have a generation that is retiring and we're going to have a talent gap. We've been talking about that for quite some time. You see all sorts of stats of enrollment in engineering schools or in the mining curriculum, whether it's geology or mining engineers, has cut in half, if not reduced by more than half. And so we're focused on bringing talent in the industry and making the industry more attractive, and the reputation of the industry sometimes hasn't been that good. And then you might say to somebody in high school, let's get into the extractive industry because look at all of the technology and so on, and everybody, you might have kids say, that's not something, where I want to be. Mm-hmm. So I think we've got to do better at telling our story. We got to do better at talking about the cool jobs that we have in our industry. In sustainability, in water treatment, in restoring and revegetation. So there are other ways to contribute and be part of this industry than just being in a mine. And from a curriculum perspective, what's the capabilities that we're trying to build? One of the engineering schools in the U.S., Northwestern, changed their curriculum and also changed who they were, their admission process, and their motto became, we're producing whole brain engineers. And they started working with the law school and the med school and the business school on some cross collaboration and working on different projects together, and really change and work to draw students from the arts world and so on.
We're not doing it the way we used to do it.
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
We're going to have to bring that new thinking
that new thinking
in. And that creates that level of innovation. Daniella, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
This has been a
really
good
enjoyed our conversation. Appreciate it. Have a good rest of the conference.
Thanks for listening to the Northern Ontario Mining Showcase podcast. The series is produced for the Echo Community Podcast Network by Story Studio Network and Clark Communications. For more information, visit our website, northbayecho.ca.